What if I told you that one of the bravest battles of the Second World War began after the war for France was already considered lost? It sounds impossible, doesn't it? When most people think about the fall of France, they picture endless columns of German tanks racing across the countryside, frightened civilians fleeing their homes, and a nation collapsing in what feels like the blink of an eye. They remember Paris falling. They remember the evacuation at Dunkirk. They remember the speed of Hitler's blitzkrieg. But almost no one remembers the small town of Saumur. And perhaps that is exactly why this story deserves to be told. By the middle of June, the future of France seemed painfully clear. The government was preparing to ask for an armistice. Entire military formations were retreating toward the south. Roads were packed with families carrying whatever belongings they could fit onto bicycles, horse carts, or old automobiles. Some soldiers had been fighting almost without rest for weeks. Others no longer knew where their commanding officers were. Across the country, there was a growing feeling that the battle was over, even if the official surrender had not yet been signed. If you had stood beside the Loire River during those dark days, you probably would have believed exactly the same thing. The German army appeared unstoppable. Every day, new reports arrived describing another city captured, another defensive line broken, another desperate withdrawal. The world watched one of Europe's greatest military powers crumble under the weight of a new kind of warfare. For many French civilians, survival had become more important than resistance. For many commanders, preserving the lives of their remaining troops seemed far more reasonable than sacrificing them in a battle that could not possibly change the outcome. History would probably have understood that decision. After all, what difference could one more battle make? What difference could a few hundred men possibly make against one of the most powerful armies on earth? Those questions seem logical. They even seem compassionate. Yet history has a strange way of reminding us that logic alone has never defined courage. Because while thousands were moving away from the front, a very different decision was being made inside a military academy in the quiet town of Saumur. The young men studying there were not hardened veterans. Many were barely old enough to have finished their military education. They had spent far more time in classrooms than on battlefields. They had practiced cavalry tactics, leadership, discipline, and tradition. Like countless military students before them, they expected that one day they might serve their country. Few imagined that their greatest test would arrive before their training had even truly ended. Then everything changed. Instead of packing their bags and escaping south, they began preparing for combat. They gathered rifles instead of textbooks. They studied maps instead of lesson plans. The sound of classroom discussions was replaced by the construction of barricades and defensive positions. The bridges crossing the Loire River suddenly became far more important than graduation ceremonies. Imagine being one of those cadets. You know your country is collapsing. You know your government may surrender within days. You know the enemy has more soldiers, more tanks, more artillery, and complete control of the momentum. And yet, someone asks you a simple question. Will you stay? Not because victory is likely. Not because reinforcements are coming. Not because history promises your sacrifice will change the war. But because someone must stand. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not born from confidence. They are born from responsibility. Throughout history, we often celebrate the winners. We admire the generals who conquered continents and the armies that marched into victorious capitals. Yet some of the most powerful stories belong to people who understood they would probably lose and still chose to do what they believed was right. That is what makes the Battle of Saumur so remarkable. It was never simply about defeating the German army. It became something much larger. It became a statement that honor could survive even when victory could not. It became proof that a nation's spirit is measured not only by the battles it wins, but also by the battles it refuses to abandon. There is a timeless lesson hidden inside this forgotten chapter of history. In every generation, people eventually face moments when success is uncertain and the easier path is to walk away. The decisions we make during those moments often define our character far more than the victories we celebrate later. The cadets at Saumur remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, nor is it the expectation of success. Courage is choosing to stand when every reason tells you to leave. But before we can understand why these young officers made that extraordinary choice, we first need to understand the desperate situation facing France itself. How could one of Europe's strongest armies collapse so quickly? Why did so many leaders believe the war was already over? And why did the tiny town of Saumur suddenly find itself standing directly in the path of Hitler's unstoppable advance? Before we continue, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you knew the battle was almost certainly lost, would you have stayed and fought, or would you have chosen to save your life? Share your answer in the comments below. I read as many of your perspectives as I can, and your insights often make these conversations even more meaningful. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture, because to understand the courage of Saumur, we first have to understand just how close France truly was to the edge. To understand why the young cadets at Saumur chose to stand and fight, we first have to step back and look at the France they were trying to defend. Because by the time the Battle of Saumur began, France was not simply losing a campaign. To many people, it looked as though an entire nation was taking its final breath. Only a few weeks earlier, confidence had still existed. France possessed one of the largest armies in Europe. Its generals believed the powerful Maginot Line would discourage a direct German invasion, just as strong fortifications had done in the previous World War. Many expected another long, exhausting conflict, one dominated by trenches, artillery, and slow advances. Instead, Germany unleashed something entirely different. Blitzkrieg was more than just fast-moving tanks. It was a carefully coordinated system that combined armored divisions, motorized infantry, aircraft, artillery, and rapid communication. German commanders did not simply attack enemy positions. They bypassed them, isolated them, and shattered their ability to respond. Before many French units even understood where the main attack was happening, German spearheads were already far behind their defensive lines. The speed was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire headquarters lost contact with frontline divisions. Telephone lines were cut. Messengers never arrived. Orders that had seemed perfectly reasonable in the morning became completely irrelevant by the afternoon. Soldiers were often asked to defend positions that had already been surrounded, while other units withdrew because they believed they had been abandoned. For ordinary civilians, the situation was even more heartbreaking. Imagine waking up to the sound of church bells, only to discover that your neighbors were hurriedly loading everything they owned onto wagons and bicycles. Mothers carried frightened children. Elderly couples pushed carts filled with blankets and family photographs. Farmers released livestock because they had no way to take them along. Roads that once connected peaceful villages became endless rivers of exhausted refugees stretching toward the south. Many had no destination. They only knew they had to keep moving. Meanwhile, above them, German aircraft roared across the sky, reminding everyone that nowhere truly felt safe anymore. Then came another devastating blow. Arras, one of the world's greatest cities, was declared an open city to spare it from destruction. Instead of becoming the scene of a desperate last battle, the French capital was abandoned without major resistance. German troops marched through its streets while shocked citizens watched from behind closed windows and half-drawn curtains. Around the world, newspapers published photographs that seemed almost unimaginable. The city that had symbolized French culture, art, and pride was now under German control. For millions of French citizens, hope began to disappear. Political leaders started discussing an armistice. Senior military commanders openly questioned whether continued resistance served any practical purpose. Every additional battle meant more casualties. Every destroyed town meant more suffering for civilians. From a purely military perspective, many believed the outcome had already been decided. And honestly, their reasoning was not entirely irrational. If defeat is inevitable, should leaders continue sacrificing lives? If an army can no longer stop the enemy, is surrender an act of weakness or an act of responsibility? These are uncomfortable questions, and they have followed military leaders throughout history. There are moments when courage demands fighting at all costs. There are also moments when wisdom demands preserving lives for the future. The challenge is knowing the difference. That is exactly why the decision made at Saumur remains so extraordinary. The cadets were fully aware of everything happening around them. They knew Paris had fallen. They knew their government was preparing to negotiate. They knew German armoured columns were sweeping across France with astonishing speed. Unlike the myths that sometimes grow around famous last stands, these young men were not blinded by false optimism. They understood the reality better than most. And yet, they still chose to prepare for battle. Not because they believed they could win the war. Not because they imagined reinforcements would suddenly appear. Not because they expected history to reward them. They fought because they believed there was still value in fulfilling their duty, even when victory had slipped beyond reach. That idea can be difficult for us to understand today. Modern society often measures success by the final result. We celebrate winners, champions, and conquerors. But military history teaches a different lesson. Sometimes the true measure of leadership is not whether you can guarantee success. Sometimes it is whether you continue doing what is right when success is no longer guaranteed. That is one of the enduring lessons of Saumur. Character is often revealed not when circumstances are favorable, but when everything seems to be falling apart. The easiest path is usually the one everyone else is already taking. The harder path is standing firm when the outcome offers little hope of personal reward. As the German advance reached the Loire River, the people of Saumur now faced a decision unlike any they had imagined only weeks before. If they intended to resist, they would have to do it, with limited resources, little time, and almost no expectation of outside help. So the question was no longer whether France could be saved. The question had become something much smaller. And, in many ways, much more personal. Who would stay? Who would leave? And how could a quiet military school possibly transform itself into the last line of defense against one of the most powerful armies the world had ever seen? Before we move on, I would love to hear your opinion. If you had been one of those young cadets, knowing that your country was on the verge of surrender, would you still have chosen to defend the Loire River? Or would you have believed that preserving your life was the wiser decision? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your perspectives, because history becomes even more meaningful when we explore these difficult choices together. In the next chapter, we will meet the remarkable young men who made that decision and discover how an ordinary military academy became the birthplace of one of France's most unforgettable acts of courage. History often remembers famous generals, decorated commanders and political leaders whose decisions shaped the course of nations. Yet every so often, history quietly reminds us that extraordinary courage is not reserved for experienced heroes. Sometimes it belongs to young men who have barely begun their journey. That is exactly what happened at Saumur. The defenders waiting along the Loire River were not battle-hardened veterans returning from years of combat. They were students. Most of them were officer cadets from the cavalry school of Saumur, one of France's most respected military academies. Their average age was only around 20. Many had spent far more hours studying military theory than firing live ammunition. Their days had been filled with riding drills, leadership exercises, classroom lectures, and tactical discussions. They dreamed of becoming officers someday, leading soldiers with confidence and professionalism after completing their education. No one imagined that someday would arrive so suddenly. Only weeks earlier, these young men had been preparing for examinations, practical exercises, and graduation. Like students everywhere, they joked with classmates, worried about their future careers, and looked forward to beginning the next chapter of their lives. Then the German invasion swept across France with astonishing speed, turning classrooms into command posts almost overnight. Everything they had trained for suddenly became real. The instructors who had once corrected assignments were now issuing combat orders. Training rifles were replaced with live weapons. Maps used for classroom demonstrations became plans for real defensive positions. The peaceful rhythm of academy life disappeared, replaced by the urgency of preparing for war. What makes their story even more remarkable is that they were not ordered into a hopeless last stand by a distant government desperate for symbolic resistance. In fact, the opposite was true. By this stage of the campaign, French authorities were already discussing an armistice. Across much of the country, military units were withdrawing to avoid unnecessary casualties. There was no expectation that the cadets had to sacrifice themselves simply to make a political statement. In theory, many of them could have left. They had every reason to believe that continuing the fight would accomplish very little. Yet something deeper held them in place. Their commanding officer, Colonel Charles Michon, understood the reality as clearly as anyone. He knew the German army possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers, armor, artillery, and air power. He knew reinforcements were unlikely to arrive. He knew that every additional day of resistance increased the risk that his cadets would never see their families again. Even so, he believed that the bridges across the Loire should not be abandoned without a fight. His message was simple. If France could no longer defend every mile of its territory, it could still defend its honor. For the young cadets listening to those words, this was no longer merely a military assignment. It became a test of everything they had spent years learning. Duty, discipline, leadership, responsibility. Those principles had always sounded noble inside a classroom. Now, they carried the weight of life and death. Imagine standing among those cadets on that quiet evening. The river flows gently beneath the bridges. The summer air feels almost peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, artillery echoes across the countryside. You know the enemy is approaching. You know your country may officially surrender within days. You know that surviving is far more likely if you simply walk away. Then, you look around. Your classmates are still there. Your instructors are still there. No one is forcing anyone to stay. Yet one by one, they make the same choice. They remain. That quiet decision may have required more courage than charging across an open battlefield. Throughout military history, we often associate bravery with dramatic moments of combat. But sometimes the hardest act of courage happens before the first shot is ever fired. It happens in silence, when a person looks honestly at the odds, understands the consequences, and still chooses duty over fear. The cadets of Saumur made that decision together. Among them were future officers who had never commanded troops in battle. Some came from military families, while others had grown up with no expectation of becoming symbols of national resistance. They represented different regions of France, different backgrounds, and different dreams for the future. Yet in those final days before the battle, those differences faded away. They became one unit, one purpose, one promise: to delay the German advance for as long as they possibly could. Their stand would never reverse the collapse of France. It would never stop Hitler's armies from marching forward. But perhaps that was never the point. Sometimes history asks people to achieve the impossible. Other times, it simply asks them to do the right thing, regardless of the outcome. That is one of the greatest lessons the Battle of Saumur still offers us today. True leadership is not measured only by victories or promotions. It is revealed when ordinary people remain faithful to their responsibilities after hope itself begins to disappear. Character is often forged in moments when walking away is both easier and safer. The young cadets had made their choice. Now, they faced an even greater challenge. Choosing to fight was only the beginning. The real question was whether a military academy with limited weapons, almost no armored support, and only a handful of determined defenders could transform itself into a fortress capable of slowing one of the most powerful armies in the world. Before we move on, I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you think courage is something people are born with, or is it a choice made in moments of crisis? Share your opinion in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your perspectives, and they often add a new dimension to these remarkable stories from history. In the next chapter, we will see how these young cadets turned classrooms into command posts, training grounds into defensive lines, and an ordinary military school into one of the most unexpected strongholds of the Second World War. Making the decision to fight was only the beginning. The much harder challenge was figuring out how. The young cadets at Saumur were not defending a massive fortress with thick concrete walls or endless supplies of ammunition. They were defending a military school that had never been designed to withstand an assault by one of the most experienced armies in the world. If the German columns reached the Loire River in full strength, the battle could be over within hours. The cadets understood that better than anyone. So instead of wasting precious time hoping for reinforcements that would never arrive, they focused on the only advantage they still possessed: preparation. Almost overnight, the peaceful academy transformed into something entirely different. Classrooms that had echoed with lectures about military history became planning rooms where officers spread maps across wooden tables and debated every possible route the Germans might take. Training fields where young cavalry officers had once practiced maneuvers now filled with piles of sandbags, crates of ammunition, and hastily assembled defensive positions. The atmosphere changed so quickly that it must have felt as though two different worlds existed within the same walls. Only days before, these young men had been preparing for examinations. Now, they were preparing for survival. One of the greatest strengths available to the defenders was geography. The Loire River stretched across central France like a natural barrier, forcing any attacking army to cross a limited number of bridges if it hoped to maintain the speed that had become the hallmark of blitzkrieg. That meant the battle would not be fought across hundreds of miles. It would be concentrated at a handful of crossing points. The cadets immediately recognized the opportunity. If they could deny those bridges to the Germans, even for a short time, they could force one of the fastest armies in Europe to slow down. Sometimes, in warfare, slowing an enemy can be almost as valuable as defeating one. Every bridge became a battlefield before the fighting had even begun. Explosive charges were carefully prepared beneath key crossings. Machine gun positions were hidden to create overlapping fields of fire. Marksmen selected locations that offered clear views of the riverbanks, while remaining difficult for the enemy to detect. Roadblocks appeared along likely avenues of approach. Every available vehicle, wagon, and construction material suddenly became part of the defense. Nothing was considered too ordinary to be useful. This was not the work of professional combat engineers supported by vast resources. It was the work of instructors and cadets improvising with whatever they could find. That reality makes their achievement even more impressive. The defenders faced shortages almost everywhere. They had very few heavy weapons. Their anti-tank capability was extremely limited. Ammunition had to be carefully conserved, because there was little chance of replacement. Even transportation presented challenges, as many military vehicles had already been lost or reassigned during the retreat across France. Against them stood an army equipped with modern tanks, experienced infantry, powerful artillery, and complete confidence after weeks of uninterrupted victories. On paper, the comparison seemed almost absurd. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that battles are not always decided by equipment alone. Preparation matters. Leadership matters. Discipline matters. And perhaps most importantly, understanding the terrain can change everything. Military academies around the world still teach one timeless principle. Never fight the enemy on their terms if you can force them to fight on yours. The cadets of Saumur could not match German firepower, but they could shape the battlefield. Instead of allowing armored columns to race freely through open countryside, they forced them toward narrow crossings where numbers mattered less and careful planning mattered far more. It was a simple idea. Yet simple ideas when executed well, often become surprisingly powerful. There is another lesson hidden within these preparations. Many people imagine courage as something dramatic, filled with explosions and heroic charges across open fields. But real courage often looks much quieter. It looks like digging trenches before sunrise, carrying heavy ammunition boxes despite exhaustion, spending hours reinforcing a position that may be destroyed within minutes, preparing carefully for a battle you sincerely hope never comes. The cadets were not chasing glory. They were buying time. One sandbag at a time. One barricade at a time. One bridge at a time. Imagine walking through the academy during those final hours before the German arrival. Instead of hearing the voices of students discussing tactics for future campaigns, you would hear the steady sound of shovels cutting into the earth. Instead of polished parade grounds, you would see firing positions hidden behind walls and hedgerows. Instead of polished uniforms prepared for graduation, you would see young faces covered with dust, sweat, and quiet determination. No speeches. No celebration. Only work. Because everyone understood that every minute spent preparing might save lives once the shooting began. Perhaps the greatest mistake any victorious army can make is believing that a smaller opponent will collapse without a fight. The German army had become accustomed to breathtaking success throughout the campaign in France. City after city had fallen. Defensive lines had crumbled. Entire armies had retreated. From the German perspective, Saumur appeared to be little more than another obstacle on the road south. It looked like a problem that would disappear almost as soon as it appeared. They were about to discover how dangerous underestimating determined defenders could be. The preparations at Saumur would never make the battlefield equal. The Germans still possessed overwhelming advantages in manpower, armor, artillery, and mobility. But equality had never been the objective. Delay was. Every hour gained would matter. Every bridge held would matter. Every unexpected burst of resistance would matter. That is another enduring lesson from this forgotten battle. Success is not always measured by achieving the impossible. Sometimes it is measured by accomplishing the most important task that remains within your reach. For the cadets of Saumur, that task was clear. Hold the Loire. Hold it for as long as humanly possible. And soon, they would discover whether weeks of careful preparation could withstand the full force of Hitler's blitzkrieg. Before we continue, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you had been responsible for defending Saumur with such limited resources, what would have been your first priority: destroying the bridges, strengthening defensive positions, or preserving your forces for a later fight? Share your opinion in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your ideas because military history often reminds us that different minds can approach the same challenge in very different ways. In the next chapter, the waiting finally comes to an end. The first German units reach the Loire, the opening shots echo across the river, and the young cadets face the greatest test of their lives as blitzkrieg collides with resistance it never expected to find. There comes a moment in every battle when preparation ends and reality begins. For the young defenders at Saumur, that moment arrived with the distant growl of engines. At first, it was only a faint sound carried across the warm summer air. Then it became impossible to ignore. German armoured columns were approaching the Loire River exactly as the cadets had expected. Dust rose above the roads. Scout vehicles moved cautiously ahead of the main force. Behind them came trucks filled with infantry, artillery pieces, and armoured vehicles that had already crossed much of France with astonishing speed. For weeks, this advance had seemed unstoppable. Town after town had fallen. Bridge after bridge had been captured or abandoned. Every victory had reinforced the growing belief that nothing could slow the momentum of blitzkrieg. From the German perspective, Saumur appeared to be one more obstacle that would disappear before the day was over. What they did not realize was that this crossing would be different. The defenders remained silent. Hidden behind stone walls, sandbags, and carefully chosen firing positions, The cadets resisted the temptation to open fire too early. Every bullet mattered. Every shell had to count. They understood that wasting ammunition against distant targets would only weaken their ability to stop the assault when it truly began. That level of discipline is often overlooked when people think about courage. Real courage is not firing first. Sometimes it is having the patience to wait. As German reconnaissance units edged closer to the bridges, they reported only scattered resistance. From a distance, the town appeared unusually quiet. There were no massive troop concentrations, no endless rows of artillery, no visible signs of a large defensive army. To experienced German commanders, this silence suggested that whatever resistance remained would collapse the moment pressure was applied. It was a dangerous assumption. The first serious attempt to seize the crossings was met with something the advancing troops had encountered surprisingly little during the campaign through France: well-organized resistance. Machine guns suddenly erupted from concealed positions overlooking the river. French riflemen fired with deliberate accuracy rather than panic. Every approach to the bridges became a killing zone where the attackers found themselves exposed while the defenders remained protected. The battle, that many Germans expected to finish quickly, had suddenly become far more complicated. Again and again, assault groups attempted to move closer to the crossings. Again and again, they were forced back. The cadets understood that they did not need to destroy the entire German army. They only needed to deny it freedom of movement. That distinction changed everything. Whenever engineers attempted to prepare a crossing, French fire forced them to seek cover. Whenever infantry gathered for another advance, carefully aimed volleys disrupted their formations. The defenders refused to waste ammunition on reckless shooting. Instead, they waited for moments when every round could make a difference. It was exactly the kind of disciplined fire control that military instructors had spent years teaching inside the academy. Now those classroom lessons were saving lives. One of the most critical moments came when bridges that could no longer be safely defended were prepared for demolition. The decision to destroy a bridge is never taken lightly. Bridges connect communities. They support trade. They allow families to travel and cities to grow. But in war, they become something else. They become objectives. By denying those crossings to the Germans, the defenders forced the attackers to spend precious time searching for alternative routes or constructing temporary crossings under constant fire. Every delay slowed the advance. Every delay disrupted the carefully planned rhythm of blitzkrieg. This illustrates one of the most important principles of military strategy. Speed is not simply about moving quickly. It is about maintaining momentum. Once momentum is interrupted, even the strongest army becomes vulnerable to confusion, hesitation, and unexpected setbacks. That is exactly what began happening along the Loire. German commanders now faced a problem they had not anticipated. The defenders were neither surrendering nor retreating. Instead, they fought with remarkable discipline despite their obvious disadvantages. The attackers soon realized they could not simply drive across the bridges and continue south. They would have to earn every crossing. For the cadets, however, every success came at a price. German artillery gradually entered the battle. Shells exploded around defensive positions, sending clouds of dust, stone, and shattered timber into the air. Buildings that had stood peacefully for generations suddenly became targets. Windows shattered. Roofs collapsed. Smoke drifted through streets that only days earlier had been filled with students preparing for military careers. Even under relentless bombardment, the defenders adapted. Rather than remaining fixed in one location, small groups shifted between prepared positions whenever possible, making it difficult for German gunners to eliminate them completely. Today, military professionals call this maintaining survivability through mobility. The cadets simply called it doing whatever was necessary to keep fighting. Their instructors had taught them another lesson that now proved invaluable. Never allow the enemy to dictate the battle. If one firing position became too dangerous, another was already waiting. If one route was blocked, another had been prepared. Planning before the battle gave them options once the battle began. Perhaps this is one reason why the Germans found the resistance so frustrating. They had expected fear. Instead, they encountered professionalism. Not the professionalism of seasoned veterans with years of combat experience. The professionalism of young officers applying everything they had learned with extraordinary determination. There is an important lesson hidden within these opening hours of the battle. People often assume that success comes from having the greatest resources. History suggests otherwise. Preparation can compensate for weakness. Discipline can overcome panic. And a small group united by a clear purpose can often achieve far more than its numbers suggest. The cadets at Saumur were proving exactly that. They were not winning the war, but they were accomplishing the mission they had set for themselves. They were forcing one of the most powerful armies in Europe to slow down, hour by hour, bridge by bridge, shot by shot. For the German commanders, what had begun as another routine advance was becoming an increasingly expensive and time-consuming operation. And if the first attacks had been frustrating, the next phase of the battle would become even more surprising. Fresh German forces, heavier weapons, and greater determination were about to collide with defenders who refused to believe their duty had ended simply because victory seemed impossible. Before we move on, I would love to hear your thoughts. Which quality do you think mattered most during these opening hours of the battle? Careful preparation, disciplined leadership, or the determination of the cadets themselves? Share your opinion in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your perspectives, because every great battle can be understood from many different angles. In the next chapter, we will see how a fight that was expected to last only a short time stretched into days, forcing the Wehrmacht to commit more men, more firepower, and far more effort than anyone had anticipated. By the time the first day of fighting came to an end, one fact had become impossible for both sides to ignore. The Battle of Saumur was supposed to be over. It was not. For the German commanders leading the advance across France, this was an unexpected complication. They had spent weeks witnessing defensive lines collapse one after another. Entire armies had retreated. Cities had fallen with astonishing speed. Every successful operation reinforced the belief that momentum itself had become one of their greatest weapons. Saumur, at first glance, seemed no different. A relatively small force. A military school. A handful of bridges. Surely it would take only a few hours before the road south was open once again. Instead, those hours stretched into another day. Then another. And then another. For nearly 4 days, the defenders continued resisting against overwhelming odds. That may not sound remarkable at first. After all, there are battles that lasted for months or even years. But context changes everything. This was not a massive fortress supplied by endless convoys. This was not an army of hundreds of thousands. This was a small force of cadets, instructors, and supporting troops standing against one of the most experienced military machines on Earth during the height of its greatest campaign. Every additional hour represented a failure of German expectations. Every delayed crossing disrupted carefully planned operations farther south. Every report describing continued resistance forced commanders to devote attention to a battle they had assumed would already be finished. The Germans responded in the only way they knew. They increased the pressure. More infantry arrived. Heavier artillery was brought forward. Armored vehicles searched for weak points along the defensive line. Engineers worked tirelessly to establish crossings wherever opportunities appeared. What had begun as a straightforward advance gradually developed into a determined effort to eliminate a surprisingly stubborn pocket of resistance. For the defenders, every passing day made conditions more difficult. Food became scarcer. Ammunition stocks continued to shrink. Medical supplies were limited. Exhaustion settled over men who had spent days under constant tension, rarely enjoying more than brief moments of rest before another attack began. Yet the resistance continued. One reason was the remarkable flexibility shown by the defenders. Instead of clinging stubbornly to every individual position until they were completely destroyed, small groups frequently withdrew from exposed locations and occupied secondary defensive points that had been prepared in advance. This forced German troops to fight repeatedly for ground they believed they had already secured. Again and again, they discovered that another line of resistance waited ahead. Military professionals often described this as defense in depth. The cadets simply understood that surviving long enough to keep fighting mattered more than defending every single building. Another factor that frustrated the attackers was discipline. Even under intense artillery fire, the defenders resisted the temptation to panic. Machine guns remained silent until worthwhile targets appeared. Riflemen waited patiently instead of revealing their positions unnecessarily. Every shell was treated as something valuable, because replacement was almost impossible. This careful fire control allowed relatively small numbers of defenders to create the impression of a much larger force. Sometimes perception can become a weapon all by itself. German commanders also encountered another unexpected challenge. The morale of the defenders refused to collapse. Throughout history, armies have often surrendered after realizing defeat was inevitable. Fear, exhaustion, and hopelessness can destroy an army long before enemy bullets do. That never fully happened at Saumur. The cadets knew they were unlikely to win. Yet they also understood something equally important. Their mission had never been to achieve victory in the traditional sense. Their mission was to delay every bridge that remained unusable, every assault that had to be repeated. Every hour that German forces spent fighting along the Loire represented success. When viewed through that lens, the battle looked very different. The Germans measured success by capturing ground. The defenders measured success by denying time. That difference explains why such a small force continued fighting with remarkable determination despite overwhelming odds. It also explains why many historians remember Saumur not for its final outcome, but for the professionalism displayed throughout the battle. There is another important reason this engagement deserves greater recognition. The Wehrmacht had built an almost mythical reputation during the campaign in France. Newspaper headlines around the world described seemingly unstoppable victories. Blitzkrieg appeared almost invincible. To many observers, it looked as though German forces could simply brush aside any resistance placed before them. Saumur quietly challenged that belief. It demonstrated that disciplined defenders occupying favorable terrain could still impose meaningful costs upon even the most successful attacking army. No, the cadets did not halt the German invasion. No, they did not reverse the collapse of France. But they proved something equally valuable. Blitzkrieg was not magic. It still depended upon speed, coordination, momentum. Whenever those elements were disrupted, even briefly, the advance became slower, more expensive, and far more complicated. Perhaps the greatest mistake any successful organization can make is believing its previous victories guarantee future ones. Confidence is valuable. Overconfidence is dangerous. The German army entered Saumur expecting another routine operation. Instead, it encountered defenders who refused to behave according to expectations. That lesson reaches far beyond military history. Whether in business, sports, leadership, or everyday life, underestimating determined people has always been one of the quickest paths to disappointment. Resources matter. Experience matters. Technology matters. But none of them can fully replace commitment. The young cadets had very little compared to the army advancing against them. Yet for nearly 4 days, they forced that army to earn every step forward. Eventually, however, reality could no longer be avoided. No matter how disciplined the defense remained, ammunition could not replenish itself. Destroyed bridges could not stop every crossing forever. Exhausted men could not continue fighting without end. The pressure continued to build, and with each passing hour, the defenders faced increasingly difficult choices about how much longer they could realistically continue. Their stand had already become one of the most inspiring episodes of the campaign. Now another question emerged. Had any of it actually mattered? Did those 4 remarkable days accomplish anything beyond delaying the inevitable? Or was the true significance of Saumur never meant to be measured in territory captured or battles won? Before we continue, I would love to hear your thoughts. In your opinion, can a battle still be considered a success if it fails to achieve victory, but accomplishes its mission and inspires future generations? Share your perspective in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your insights, because history often becomes most meaningful when we debate the questions it leaves behind. In the next chapter, we will explore the deeper legacy of Saumur and ask whether this forgotten battle was militarily insignificant or whether its greatest victory was something that could never be measured on a battlefield. When the guns finally began to fall silent around Saumur, one question lingered above all the others. Had any of it truly mattered? On the surface, the answer seemed painfully simple. France would soon sign an armistice. The German advance would continue. The Battle of Saumur had not changed the outcome of the campaign. The cadets had not driven the enemy back across the Loire. They had not saved Paris. They had not prevented the occupation of France. If we judge the battle only by maps, territory, or military statistics, it would be easy to dismiss Saumur as little more than a courageous but ultimately unsuccessful stand. And for many years, that is exactly how some people viewed it. But history has a fascinating habit of asking deeper questions than maps can answer. Because not every victory is measured by land gained. And not every defeat is measured by land lost. Sometimes the most important outcome of a battle cannot be found on the battlefield at all. To understand why, imagine yourself as a young French citizen living during those dark days of the summer of 1940. Every newspaper carried stories of retreat. Every radio broadcast seemed to announce another defeat. Entire communities watched soldiers march south instead of north. Many people began wondering whether France had simply stopped believing in itself. Then, word began to spread. A group of officer cadets at Saumur had refused to surrender without a fight. They had defended the Loire against overwhelming odds. They had delayed the German advance for days instead of hours. Suddenly, the story was no longer about winning. It became a story about refusing to give up. That distinction mattered far more than many people realized at the time. Military victories can change borders. Moral victories can change people. Throughout history, there have been battles remembered not because they altered the immediate outcome of a war, but because they demonstrated the values a nation wished to preserve. Think about the defenders at Thermopylae. They did not stop the Persian invasion forever. Think about the defenders of the Alamo. They did not win their battle. Think about the Marines on Wake Island. They were eventually overwhelmed. Yet generations continue to remember them because they represented something larger than military success. They represented courage in impossible circumstances. Saumur belongs in that conversation. Not because the scale was enormous. Not because the casualties were the highest. But because it reminded an exhausted nation that honor had not disappeared, even during its darkest hour. Professional historians continue to debate the precise military significance of the battle. Some argue that every delay along the Loire complicated German operations, even if only briefly. Additional time forced German commanders to coordinate fresh assaults, commit more resources, and slow the relentless rhythm that had defined blitzkrieg throughout the campaign. Others believe the overall strategic impact remained limited because France was already approaching surrender. Both arguments contain elements of truth. And perhaps that is exactly why Saumur remains so fascinating. Its greatest importance may never have rested entirely in military calculations. Instead, it lived in memory. The young cadets demonstrated that disciplined resistance was still possible. That example carried weight long after the battle itself had ended. In the years that followed, countless members of the French resistance would risk imprisonment, torture, and execution while refusing to accept occupation as permanent. Of course, the resistance emerged from many different people, places, and experiences. It would be an oversimplification to suggest that Saumur alone inspired an entire movement. History is rarely that simple. Yet stories like Saumur became powerful symbols, reminding people that even when governments surrender, individual conscience does not have to surrender with them. That may be one of the most enduring truths of the entire Second World War. Armies can occupy cities. They cannot automatically occupy principles. They can capture territory. They cannot easily capture dignity. The cadets understood this instinctively. They knew they were unlikely to become the generation remembered for saving France. Instead, they became the generation remembered for refusing to abandon its ideals when those ideals were hardest to defend. There is another lesson hidden within this forgotten battle, one that reaches far beyond military history. Modern life often teaches us to judge everything by visible results. Did you succeed? Did you win? Did you achieve your goal? Those questions certainly matter. But they are not the only questions worth asking. Sometimes we should also ask whether we acted with integrity, whether we remained faithful to our responsibilities, whether we continued doing the right thing after success became uncertain. Those are much harder questions. The cadets of Saumur answered them with their actions rather than their words. Their example reminds us that character is often revealed most clearly when there is little hope of recognition, reward, or victory. Anyone can remain committed while success seems certain. It takes extraordinary conviction to remain committed when failure appears almost inevitable. Perhaps that is why this forgotten battle continues to resonate more than 8 decades later. Not because it changed the map of Europe, but because it challenged the way we define success itself. Maybe the true measure of a soldier is not always whether he wins. Maybe it is whether he chooses honor when surrender would be easier. Maybe the true measure of a nation is not whether it never falls. Maybe it is whether its values survive even after defeat. The Battle of Saumur quietly answered those questions. Its defenders lost the battlefield. Yet they preserved something that could not be conquered by tanks or artillery. They preserved the belief that duty still mattered, that honor still mattered, that courage still mattered. And sometimes, those victories last much longer than military ones. Before we move to the final chapter, I would love to hear your thoughts. In your opinion, which has the greater impact on history, a military victory that people eventually forget, or a courageous defeat that inspires generations? Share your perspective in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your thoughts because these conversations remind us that history is not only about facts, but also about the meaning we find within them. In the final chapter, we will discover how the legacy of Saumur endured long after the smoke cleared, why France still remembers these young cadets with deep respect, and what their extraordinary stand can still teach us in the modern world. When the Battle of Saumur finally came to an end, the battlefield fell silent. The smoke slowly drifted away from the bridges across the Loire. The gunfire faded. The shattered buildings remained. The defenders laid down their weapons. And like so many battles throughout history, life seemed to move on. But some stories never truly end when the shooting stops. In many ways, that is exactly where the real story of Saumur begins. From a purely military perspective, the campaign in France was over. The armistice would soon take effect, and much of the country entered a difficult period of occupation. Across Europe, attention shifted to the next phase of the war as Germany appeared stronger than ever. It would have been easy for the Battle of Saumur to disappear into the background. After all, larger battles had been fought. Greater armies had clashed. Far more lives had been lost elsewhere. Yet Saumur refused to be forgotten. Not because of its size, but because of what it represented. In the months and years that followed, the story of the young cadets spread quietly throughout France. Military officers remembered how a handful of students had chosen responsibility over safety. Families remembered that not every French soldier had abandoned the fight. Veterans remembered that discipline and honor had survived even during one of the nation's darkest moments. The battle gradually became something more than a historical event. It became a symbol. One of the most remarkable aspects of this story is the respect shown by both friend and foe. German officers who fought against the defenders reportedly acknowledged the determination and professionalism displayed by the cadets. In an era defined by brutal warfare, respect between opposing soldiers was never common, but it was not impossible. Experienced commanders understood courage when they saw it, regardless of which uniform a man happened to wear. That quiet recognition made the stand at Saumur even more meaningful. Respect earned from an ally is valuable. Respect earned from an enemy is unforgettable. Many of the young men who defended the Loire survived the battle. Some continued serving France in different ways during the difficult years that followed. Others carried the memory of those days for the rest of their lives, rarely describing themselves as heroes. That humility may be one of the most inspiring parts of their story. The cadets never fought for fame. They never imagined documentaries would one day tell their story. They never expected monuments or ceremonies. They simply believed that their duty required them to stand their ground. History rewarded them only much later. The cavalry school at Saumur also endured. Long after the war ended, it continued training generations of French officers, carrying forward traditions shaped not only by victories, but also by sacrifice. New cadets walked through the same grounds where young students had once exchanged textbooks for rifles. They learned military tactics, leadership, and discipline, but they also inherited something less tangible: a legacy, a reminder that leadership is tested most severely when circumstances appear hopeless. Visitors who come to Saumur today may see a peaceful riverside town filled with history, beautiful architecture, and quiet streets. It is difficult to imagine that those same bridges once echoed with artillery fire and rifle shots. Time has a remarkable ability to heal landscapes. It does not erase memory. If anything, peaceful places often remind us even more powerfully of the price paid to preserve them. That is why memorials matter. Not because stone monuments can fully explain history, but because they encourage each new generation to ask questions. Who were these people? Why did they stay? What would I have done? Those questions keep history alive. They transform names carved into memorials into real human beings with fears, hopes, families, and impossible decisions. Perhaps that is the greatest gift the cadets left behind. They remind us that history is never just about famous leaders or decisive victories. It is also about ordinary people who quietly chose to do extraordinary things. There is an important lesson hidden within their legacy. Many people spend their lives believing that only spectacular achievements deserve to be remembered. We often assume that recognition belongs exclusively to those who win championships, command great armies, or change the course of history. The Battle of Saumur tells a different story. Sometimes the greatest legacy comes not from changing the outcome, but from changing the meaning of the outcome. France lost the campaign, but the young defenders of Saumur ensured that the nation did not lose its sense of honor. That distinction matters. Military defeats eventually become chapters in history books. Acts of courage become part of a nation's identity. More than 8 decades have passed since those extraordinary days along the Loire River. The world has changed beyond anything the cadets could have imagined. The tanks are different. The uniforms are different. The technology is different. Yet the questions they faced remain surprisingly familiar. What does duty require when success seems impossible? What does leadership look like when hope is fading? What is the value of honor in a world that often measures everything by victory alone? The young men at Saumur answered those questions without expecting applause. Their answer was simple: Stand together. Do your duty. Leave the outcome to history. Perhaps that is why France continues to remember them with such respect. Not because they achieved the impossible, but because they proved that even in defeat, dignity could survive. And sometimes, dignity becomes the most enduring victory of all. Before we conclude this remarkable journey, I would love to hear from you. Which story from the Second World War has inspired you the most, and why? Is there another forgotten battle or overlooked act of courage that you believe deserves to be remembered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly enjoy reading your recommendations, and many of the stories featured on this channel begin with conversations just like these. In our final chapter, we will step back one last time and reflect on why the Battle of Saumur still speaks to us today, not simply as a forgotten battle of the Second World War, but as a timeless reminder that courage is sometimes measured not by victory, but by a willingness to stand when almost everyone else has chosen to walk away. More than 8 decades have passed since the young cadets stood beside the Loire River. The tanks that thundered across Europe are now museum exhibits. The rifles have long since fallen silent. The bridges have been rebuilt. The scars left by artillery have faded beneath peaceful streets and quiet riverside paths. To someone visiting Saumur today, it might seem impossible to imagine that this beautiful French town once stood directly in the path of one of the most powerful military advances in history. And yet, despite the passing of time, the Battle of Saumur continues to speak to us, not because of the number of soldiers involved, not because it changed the outcome of the Second World War, but because it forces us to ask a question that every generation eventually faces. What do we do when we know we cannot win? It is an uncomfortable question. Our culture often celebrates success. We admire champions. We study great victories. We remember triumphant moments when impossible odds were overcome. But life is not always like that. Sometimes we find ourselves facing challenges where victory is uncertain, resources are limited, and the future appears almost impossible to change. That is where the story of Saumur becomes timeless. The cadets never confused courage with certainty. They did not wait until success was guaranteed before deciding to act. Instead, they believe that some responsibilities remain worthwhile even when the final outcome lies beyond our control. That lesson extends far beyond the battlefield. Think about firefighters who enter burning buildings knowing they may not be able to save everyone inside. Think about doctors and nurses who continue treating patients during overwhelming crises even when they know they cannot save every life. Think about teachers working in struggling communities, because they believe even one student's future is worth fighting for. Think about parents making sacrifices every single day without knowing whether those sacrifices will ever be fully appreciated. None of these people continue because success is guaranteed. They continue because duty gives meaning to uncertainty. The cadets of Saumur understood exactly that. Perhaps this explains why military academies around the world continue to study battles that ended in defeat. Future officers are not simply taught how armies win. They are taught how leaders behave when everything begins falling apart. Because leadership is rarely tested when circumstances are comfortable. Real leadership reveals itself when difficult choices have no perfect answers. Colonel Charles Micon and his young cadets could have chosen the easier path. History would probably have understood. Few people would have blamed them for withdrawing alongside countless other exhausted units. Instead, they chose another path. Not because it was likely to succeed, because they believed it was the right thing to do. That distinction still matters today. Modern technology has transformed warfare beyond anything those young cadets could have imagined. Artificial intelligence assists military planning. Satellites observe battlefields from space. Precision-guided weapons strike targets from extraordinary distances. Yet despite all those technological changes, one truth remains exactly the same. Technology may shape battles. Character shapes decisions. And in the end, decisions shape history. There is another lesson that quietly emerges from Saumur. Never underestimate the influence of ordinary people. When we read history books, it is easy to believe that only presidents, kings, and famous generals change the world. The Battle of Saumur reminds us otherwise. Most of its defenders were not household names. Many were students whose futures had barely begun, yet their actions have continued inspiring people for generations. They remind us that history is often carried forward by individuals who never expected to become part of it. Perhaps that is why forgotten battles deserve to be remembered. Not because they replace famous victories, but because they complete our understanding of the past. Without stories like Saumur, we might mistakenly believe that history belongs only to those who win. In reality, history also belongs to those who remain faithful to their principles when winning is no longer possible. As we reach the end of this journey, it is worth returning to the question we asked at the very beginning. Why would anyone choose to fight after the war was already lost? After everything we have explored together, perhaps the answer is no longer so mysterious. The cadets of Saumur were not trying to save France by themselves. They knew that was impossible. Instead, they were trying to preserve something that no invading army could seize by force. Honor, duty, self-respect. The belief that some values remain worth defending, even in defeat. That is why the Battle of Saumur still matters. Not because it changed history, but because it changed the way history remembers those who refuse to surrender their principles. The young cadets did not save France, but they helped preserve the spirit of France. And sometimes, that becomes the victory future generations remember the longest. As we close this story, perhaps the most meaningful question is not what those young cadets chose to do. Perhaps the real question is what any of us would choose if we stood in their place. Would we walk away because success seemed impossible? Or would we stand because some things are simply worth defending, regardless of the outcome? History cannot answer that question for us. Only we can. If there is one lesson worth carrying away from Saumur, it is this: victory is never the only measure of a meaningful life. Sometimes the choices we make when success seems least likely become the choices that define us forever. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most remarkable yet overlooked battles of the Second World War. If this story gave you a new perspective on history, I hope you will help keep the memory of these young cadets alive by sharing it with others. Before you go, I would love to hear from you. Which forgotten battle from the Second World War do you think deserves more attention, and why? Leave your answer in the comments below. Your suggestions often inspire future documentaries, and I truly enjoy reading every thoughtful discussion this community creates. Until next time, thank you for watching, thank you for being part of this journey, and remember that history is not only the story of those who won, it is also the story of those who chose to stand when standing was the hardest thing of all.